is the paranormal evidence, trying to understand the science that may be behind what allows ETs to do what they do. As any of you know who's ever been to a crop circle, sometimes batteries go dead instantly in very strange circumstances, so we may have already seen a paranormal event. We'll open that possibility up. My background is as a physicist, and I really was motivated by curiosity, by trying to understand the universe at a deep level, which drew me into physics in the first place. In the mid-'80s, I had been working on my own version of a unified field theory, trying to understand how things connected together. I was not really satisfied with the explanation I'd learned in college and in graduate school. And I came across remote viewing. It was presented to me in a way that I knew it had to be true, and yet it violated everything I had been taught in school. And but I realized at the same time that maybe this is what I was missing. If I could understand remote viewing, it was a clue that our current science is missing some important things. And that started my own quest for researching every aspect of the paranormal, every subject that is ridiculed and is sort of not believed by mainstream science and mainstream culture, but to figure out for myself, is it real or not? And that process has been one of trying to be skeptical, but at the same time be open-minded, going by the evidence. And what I found is that a lot of the phenomena, including UFOs, of course, when you look into them, there's a huge amount of evidence, and our science, at least the mainstream science, has not taken it into account yet. Our current theorists who do mainstream physics in universities are not working on the phenomena that UFOs exhibit. So the net result of my research is a book, The Synchronized Universe, in which I pulled together the best evidence for a lot of the anomalies that I've investigated. And also the last chapter is sort of the beginnings of a theory. It's an attempt to say, how can we take our present science and start to expand it to begin to explain some of these things that UFOs exhibit and other paranormal phenomena show. The panel discussion on Friday night talked about possible motivations for UFOs and ETs, why they're here, what they're all about. I think to have a hope of understanding that question, it's important to see the universe the way they see it. They clearly have some capabilities we don't have, some technologies, and maybe their worldview is also quite different from ours. So as we develop a science of the paranormal, we may also be able to better answer some of those questions. There are many connections between UFO ET technology and the paranormal. I'll give you just a few examples. Of course, saucers levitate. That's one of their most spectacular features, and quietly too. But down through the ages, there are many, many credible accounts of people levitating. This is a photograph or a drawing on the right-hand side of Brother Joseph of Cupertino, a monk, and he had a habit which embarrassed his fellow monks. When he got ecstatic in prayer, he would often start lifting up into the air. They had to drag him down. Sometimes when he was serving dinner in church, he would also, when the choir began, they would make him sit in the back because he was distracting. He would sometimes lift up into the air, and he couldn't control it. It was investigated by the Pope, very thorough investigation of hundreds of witnesses, and they made him a saint because they concluded that it was real. There are many people who have exhibited this phenomena. It's just one aspect of the paranormal. Out-of-body experiences. The top drawing shows a out-of-body case described in the parapsychological literature by Mr. and Mrs. Landau. Mrs. Landau had a habit of going out of body at night while asleep. Mr. Landau was in bed and had her do an experiment where he asked her to bring an object from her bedroom across the hall into his. This sketch is taken shortly after that. She's just deposited a small stuffed dog by his bedside, and is exiting the room, except what is exiting the room is a pale, semi-transparent copy of herself, while her physical body is observable across the room. This is just one of many out-of-body cases from that scientific literature. The bottom drawing is from Betty Andreas and Luca. She's during an abduction. She's being taken in out-of-body form by a little ET. Her physical body is lying on the couch. Her OBE body is being taken up to the craft for training and teaching sessions, etc. This is often reported in abduction cases. Orbs, another phenomenon that does not fit our science, but is commonly reported in ET encounter cases. They often show up around over the bed, hovering as little balls of light of different colors. The top drawing is from Betty Andreas and Luca again, balls of light orbiting a larger sphere over a lake. The bottom photograph is from a friend of mine. A bunch of us had gone on a camp out trying to get pictures of orbs. The 12-year-old daughter of one of the people in the group took this spectacular photograph of a 3-foot diameter orb in the afternoon. So there's daylight. It's the post of the cabin is observable through the orb. Behind it, there's reflections of the sky, the trees, the ground. So it's a wonderful photograph. Orbs are often seen around haunted houses. This is a photograph around a haunted house that I used to own a part share of. They move very rapidly sometimes, thousands of feet per second, but flash photographs can show them up. In ET cases, the soul is often a topic of discussion. The bottom drawing here is from Betty Andreas de Luca, again, from one of her encounter cases, but there are many people, Whitley Strieber and many others, who have talked about lessons they have received during their abductions about the nature of the soul, the nature of reincarnation, the nature of higher dimensions. The top drawing is from Daniel Brinkley, a near-death experiencer. He's been dead 3 times, the first time for 28 minutes. He was in a body bag, ready to be taken off to the morgue, when he found himself suddenly back in the body, and he was paralyzed because of his injuries. I think the volume is too loud here. He was paralyzed due to his injuries. He could only breathe, so he made a little puff of breath that disturbed the body bag, and an orderly luckily saw it, and they didn't take him to the morgue. But during his near-death experience, he saw the typical tunnel. He went into a realm of light. There was a light being who interviewed him and projected great love. And then these other beings gave him 117 prophecies of the future. This is just one example. And he came back and he recorded them all. Dr. Raymond Moody recorded them. And at this point, about 98% of them have come true since 1975. So these other realms seem to show up in both ET cases and in near-death cases. The tunnel is often the way one gets from our physical realm to these other realms. The tunnel shows up in out-of-body experiences. Robert Monroe, who went out-of-body many times, was one of the great pioneers of out-of-body experiences, said that a black hole would appear on his wall, and that would be the entrance of a tunnel. He'd go in there and come out in some other dimension. Oftentimes, ET abduction cases, the ETs are seen coming out of little holes in the wall. This is a painting from Hieronymus Bosch that was painted hundreds of years ago, but again, it has angels, and it has a realm of light at the other end, so it's the same, it's a depiction of the same type of tunnel between dimensions. As our science progresses, we're starting to get clues about these other dimensions. They seem to be quite real. There are measurable aspects of them. In this case, Robert Monroe was having an out-of-body experience, but he did an experiment. He had a room that had a Faraday cage around it. Where there were wires in the walls of the cage. And it really sounds loud. Are you sure is it echoing back there, or? Yeah. Hello? Can we turn down the sound a little bit? There's a lot of echo out here, a lot of reverb. I'm hearing myself. So he did an experiment. He wanted to see what the effect would be of high voltage on the wires of the Faraday cage in this room. Well, hello? Is this too low? It's too low now. They said it was too high before. It was either reverbs or it's too low, one or the other. Is there any medium? This one, okay. This is not on right now, though, or is it? Okay, all right. How's this level? Is this better? Okay. I think we're in a crop circle. So what Monroe did was charge up the wires in his Faraday cage to 50,000 volts. And then he tried to have an out-of-body experience. Now, normally when there was no voltage on the wires, he went right through the wires, no problem. But with the high voltage, he found the wires trapped his astral body, ensnared it. So we're learning that, and this also has shown up in other OBE cases. And I don't know if you remember, Bill Cooper talked about an ET that was held captive back in the 50s. And whether it's a credible case, I don't know. But again, it was a Faraday cage, which he claimed was used to keep the little fellow from going out of body and escaping. So there's something real to this phenomenon. And as you may recall, the Ghostbusters movie, they used a Faraday cage on a high voltage to keep their little spirits in check. As we learn more about ET cases, there are some that give us insights into higher dimensions. Stephen Greer recounts a credible witness who was practicing going out of body. He was going up into the sky, and as he rose through the atmosphere, he bumped into something. He looked back and he found that there was a flying saucer there, a small one, that was in the astral domain, is not in the physical, but there were little beings on board who were aware of him, and he was aware of them. So it's a clue that the ETs are very familiar with astral technology, even though to us it may still be a very mysterious regime. Time travel is often encountered in contact and abduction cases. Sometimes technology hints come from cases, and these technology hints seem very relevant, trying to bridge the gap between our science and the science of the ETs. These are a couple of quotes from one of Shirley MacLaine's books, Out on a Limb. Supposedly a Pleiadian named Mayan gave the following information to one of the people in Shirley MacLaine's book. And you can either take or leave such information, but as a scientist, this information bowled me over, because to me it communicated information that made sense to me, and it was a good guide. It talks about, well, I'll read part of it. There's a force at work in the atom which acts as the cohesive element, the organizer of all matter in the cosmos, the ultimate source, the thinking element of nature. And as we go into the paranormal, you find out that there are energies which have a consciousness to them. So this actually makes sense. This force is not a molecular force, but it's related to what we call the gluons in high-energy particle physics. The gluons hold the particles of the atom together at the smallest scale. But what Mayan said in the book is that there's a long-range part of that force. It's not limited to very small scales. And that long-range part is the essence of ET technology, and it's also what makes up what we call the soul. So it's really fascinating information. What I've discovered from all of this is that the paranormal may be a window into ET technology, and so it's a very cheap way of studying what may be like the next frontier in physics. In my opinion, we're at the verge of a new scientific revolution. There are lots of things our science can't explain, even though they don't talk about it very much, and maybe even mainstream scientists aren't even aware of some of these things. But of course, dark matter, everyone is aware of. When I was in college, people were frantically banging particles together and making up a list of all the things that made up the universe. Billions of dollars over decades have been spent doing that. Now we know that that entire program tells us about only a few percent of the matter in the universe. Most of it is an unknown form. Our law of gravity is broken. If you take a pendulum and let it swing back and forth slowly, it operates according to our known physics, except during solar eclipses. It veers off in strange directions that our science cannot explain. Cold fusion was reported in the late 80s. It was then quickly ridiculed by two experiments MIT and Caltech did, done by people who had a lot to lose. They were being funded by a rival program. One of those efforts has now been shown to be fraudulent itself, and cold fusion has been duplicated and replicated by hundreds of labs around the world. Our science cannot explain it, but there's very solid evidence that it's real. Charge clusters, one more example in hard science where our current physics is not working. If you take a lot of electrons, say 10 billion electrons, and squeeze them into a spot the size of a point of a pin, a very small sphere, they stop pushing apart. Like charges are supposed to repel one another, but they don't do it if you squeeze them close enough together. It appears as though the vacuum energy, the zero-point energy, is coming into our physics at this point. And this also may be the clue to how cold fusion works, because you take a little charge cluster like this, you shoot it into a metal plate, say of pure aluminum, and after a while, as the lower graph shows, you start out with pure aluminum. After a while, you get other elements starting to appear in the metal. So the charge cluster is actually creating or causing fusion to occur. In cosmology, you hear oftentimes astronomers come on and say we understand the Big Bang, we understand our universe very well, but quasars are supposed to be at the farthest reaches of our universe. And here's a photograph that shows a nearby galaxy and three quasars that are connected to it by dust clouds, which means they have to be relatively close to each other. There are lots of examples like this to say that our cosmology is really about to come apart. We're finding some stars and some systems of stars that are older than the supposed age of the universe, which is a little hard to explain. The speed of light has been broken in some experiments. Raymond Chow at Berkeley, for one, has been able to do this, other people as well. So our speed of light does not seem to be the limit that we thought it once was. There are patents. Here's one by a Japanese inventor named Kawai, showing that this is a patent he was granted by the U.S. Patent Office of a generator that produces 3 times as much energy out as you put in. It's a free energy device. Now, he did not claim that in the patent, but in the text of the patent, he just mentions that they made some measurements, and this is what they got. The physics of time is also starting to be, is a new frontier to be explored. An astronomer named Nikolai Kozyrev in Russia has discovered that every time there's a process involving change, evaporation, burning, growth, etc., there is a certain substance, a physical effect. He calls it the density of time. This stuff can be reflected and concentrated and change the mass of other objects. It's a whole subject that does not fit in with current science. But it does have echoes in ET science, of course, and levitation. One more thing, we have the top graph here shows results from two Japanese inventors who found that a spinning gyroscope, when you spin it very fast, yeah, we just lost audio again. Back to, if I stand in the middle and shout, will that work? Hello? Oh yeah, I'm sorry, we lost it again. Okay. This on. Is this better? Okay, we'll just do this. This is Old Faithful here. Anyway, I think the gremlins are afoot. So anyway, in this particular experiment, two Japanese scientists, physicists, published a paper in Physical Review Letters, one of the most prestigious physics journals, in which they showed that spinning a gyroscope very rapidly causes it to weigh less when you spin it in one direction. Spin it the other direction, it has no effect whatsoever. This effect violates current physics. There's no explanation for it in our current science, but it does tie in very nicely with some of the work of Kozyrev and others. So we're starting to see effects here of levitation in a way that can be reproduced in the laboratory. Now that's just in the hard sciences. In the paranormal, even stranger things go on. Remote viewing is one that's been proven at this point, a 20-year CIA program that was disbanded in the mid-90s, and that produced huge amounts of data. The reviews of it have shown that they were quite accurate, despite news reports and propaganda to suggest that it was all disbanded because it wasn't working. Actually, it was working very well. I've taken 3 courses in remote viewing, and this is just one example where the target was the destruction of Pompeii. Of course, in a remote viewing session, you're not told what the target is. But I came up with a place that had Roman-style houses. In the distance, there was a mountain or a light in the sky. There was something flowing toward the people in the foreground. There was danger, confusion. You picked up all the feelings that they were experiencing at the event. For the great remote viewers like Pat Price, who was a pioneer in the program, their sessions were just amazingly accurate and detailed. This is just a review comment by Jessica Utz, a professor at the University of California, who concludes, she's a statistical expert, that the remote viewing sessions were real. They were definitely seeing something, even though we can't explain how it is that it works. What's most amazing about remote viewing and other psychic phenomena is it does not weaken with distance. Here's data from the Princeton Pear Lab showing that up to distances of 6,000 miles, there's no decrease in accuracy in remote viewing sessions. What's even more strange is that if you view targets in the future or in the past, your accuracy is not diminished. You still are able to see just as well as for current targets. Robert John, former professor, head of the engineering department at Princeton, and who runs that lab, concludes all forces known to physics, like gravity, for example, diminish with distance, and no forces in physics operate freely across time like this. It's as if consciousness is somehow able to direct its influence across space and time. This is just one graph from the Princeton Pear Lab summarizing a large body of data. They really put a lot of this stuff onto a rigorous basis by conducting hundreds of thousands or millions of experiments and doing rigorous statistics. So even though for average people the effects, the psychic abilities may be weak, the odds against chance, in other words, how real the phenomena was, are like billions to one for the final result. So this stuff has been established scientifically. Edgar Mitchell, who unfortunately was supposed to talk here this weekend, did the longest distance ESP experiment coming back from the moon and got very good data, and he's been one of the pioneers in trying to push forward this science. Over decades, many there's show that hit rates, accuracies in ESP experiments are far above chance, and there's a phenomenon here that's very real and cries out for an explanation. The Princeton Pear Lab also was one of the pioneers in PK, affecting objects at a distance. Here's an early generation. It's a vertical pinball machine where metal balls are dropped from the top. They hit little nails and bounce randomly and make a little bell-shaped curve at the bottom. They have more modern and more portable versions today where you have a little box that makes random electronic noise, and then it's recorded as ones and zeros. They're called REGs, random event generators. People are able to affect these things with their mind, with intention. Initially, experiments were done a few feet away. Now they're done thousands of miles away, and they're finding that people are able to affect these things with accuracies far beyond chance. So psychokinesis is real. PK is real. Of course, in ET encounter cases, PK is often witnessed. You see people levitating. You see people affect things at a distance. But even we humans have this ability. Even the average person has it to a very limited degree because we haven't trained. The people who are great masters at it, like Ingo Swann, can do dramatic effects with it. Here's a graph from his early experiment at Stanford, where there was a device in the basement with 7 layers of shielding around it. Superconducting shielding, lead, copper. It was a physics experiment that was designed to only be influenced when a quark came through. Hal Puthoff asked Ingo to try to go into this thing, try to remote view it with his mind, and see if he could affect it. The device is supposed to make little sine waves as an output, and for years had been operating without ever having any kind of disturbances. Ingo went in, and each time he focused his attention on one part of the device, he got a glitch, he got a change in the output, which was completely anomalous and no other way to explain it. So PK works through barriers. Another wonderful experiment shows that animals have this ability as well as humans. Baby chicks, when they're 1 day old, bond to whatever is nearest to them if they think that that's their mother. A French scientist named René Piot had a little robot that was steered by a random event generator. And we know from the Princeton experiments that random event generators are affected by consciousness, by intent. So he allowed this little robot to run around at random in a box. This is the top view. And the top frame shows the path of the robot when nothing else was present. It just randomly went around the box and bounced against the walls. Then he put these little chicks in a cage at one end of the box. These chicks had been imprinted to think the robot was its mother. What happened was the robot then began to hover around that end of the box. So somehow the chicks, because of their desire, were able to influence the random event generator to cause the robot to move only near them. So it's just an indication that animals have these abilities as well as humans do. Cleve Baxter was a polygraph expert. He taught the CIA how to use polygraphs back in the early 50s. In the mid-60s, he hooked a plant up to a polygraph and discovered that plants are psychic too, that when he thought about burning a leaf of a plant, the plant responded with a very strong electrical response as though it was able to read his mind. Many experiments have been done by many investigators since then to show that plants are psychic. You can even cut the cells up of a plant, use single cells, and they also show some kind of empathic response to other living life forms. Although everyone probably has psychic ability, most of us don't know it. Most of us are, this is an example here of a EEG from the brainwave output from a subject when on the top graph is shown when a tone is played for them. And the brain hears the tone, it processes it, it recognizes the tone, and makes a characteristic response. The bottom graph shows this same subject when an ESP message is sent to the receiver. And their brain responds in a very similar way, indicating the brain knows it's received the message. But when the subject was asked afterwards, he didn't think he'd received anything psychically. So a lot of the reason we're not aware of our psychic ability is we have not learned how to quiet the conscious mind to listen to the subconscious part of our mind, which is receiving these messages. This is why meditation, hypnosis, other ways of quieting the mind are very powerful to enable us to become more psychic, which means just listening to what's already there. We also find that certain times of day when certain stars are overhead are far better. The accuracy is greatly increased for ESP and remote viewing. I'm going to go quickly through some of these. I think we've probably lost a little time on our audio issues, but one of the most remarkable experiments shows that when you have an out-of-body experience, there is something physical that can be measured. People are tempted to believe that in an out-of-body experience, it's all just in the mind, your imagination. But this is data from a remote viewer named Alex Tannhaus. They asked him to try to go to a target and describe what was there. Around the target, they put instruments, strain gauges, optical sensors, magnetic sensors, and they found that when he was giving accurate information about the target, these sensors were all going crazy. There was some energy form that was present at the target. So our astral body appears to be real in some way and also physically detectable, demonstrable in some way. Other out-of-body experiences by Keith Harari found that when he was able to go out of body and try to affect or quiet or calm his little kitten that was very fond of him, it caused a dramatic shift in the kitten's behavior. And ghosts are one more aspect of the paranormal that we're getting more and more hard data on. Here's a photograph on the back porch of a haunted house that I used to have part of. There's no one standing there. This is a lit back porch at night. And people often think when they first look, there's a person there. But if you look more closely, it's a vortex. Actually, the clapboards on the wall behind this figure are bent and twisted upwards. And what looks like the head is actually a twisted vortex. It's a remarkable picture. Sometimes ghosts do seem to show up when there's good backlighting. But I talked to one veteran ghost hunter in Leesburg, Virginia, who has been to hundreds of houses in Leesburg that are haunted. And I asked him about photographing ghosts. He says, "No, you can't photograph a ghost." He says, "I have tried thousands of times, and you never can photograph a ghost. All you get are these darn little orbs that show up." Group consciousness is one other area where we're learning that when many minds focus on the same thing, it affects physics, it affects the nature of space-time. This is data from the OJ trial. You had millions of people focusing on the TV, looking at the same event at the same time. And there was no attempt by those people to influence these little random event generators. But what was discovered is that when they focus on the same event at the same time, that random event generators, these little devices that the Princeton Paralab and other people use, they start acting as though they're coupled together, that the noise that should be random starts to actually be coupled for generators that are even thousands of miles apart. It says that the quantum noise, which our mainstream physics thinks it understands, does not, because there's no way in current physics to explain how quantum noise can be coupled across distances like that. Another mass consciousness event, of course, was 9/11. Hours and hours before the first World Trade Tower was hit, these REGs, or random event generators, began showing anomalies, as though the mass consciousness was sort of reaching into the future and already affecting them, showing an anomaly was about to occur. Light bending, when paranormal events are present, and I'll talk in a few minutes about what that really means, because there's a certain kind of energy called subtle energy. It's called prana. It's called qi. The entire Chinese medical system is based on it. When that is present in large quantities, it can actually sort of charge up an object. Then it begins to change the physical behavior of the object. In this case, there are two cameras. One's a normal camera. One was owned by somebody who kept having problems with his camera. Because apparently he produced a lot of qi, and he kept charging this thing up. And when he took pictures with it, at the same time, all kinds of strange events. People showed up semi-transparent. Weird light streaks would appear, all kinds of strange things. The Chinese have demonstrated teleportation to VIP visitors. I have 4 friends over the years who have witnessed some of these things. Typically, they'll have a small radio transmitter in the pocket of one person, and when the teleportation occurs, the frequency of the transmitter drops to 0. When it comes up again, it's in another location. Uri Geller was also witnessed in a scientifically controlled experiment in England, teleporting a part of a crystal out of a sealed container under scientific controls, and the National Research Council reported that particular event. So teleportation does occur. Precognition, this is the other aspect, that time and space, that these paranormal phenomena just seem to move very freely through time and space. This is one set of data by Dean Radin, who found that observers several seconds before being shown an image, which might be a calming image or a disturbing image, they began to react correctly, as though they knew what kind of image was coming. From time travel, you get into prophecy, predicting the future. Prophecy shows up a lot, of course, in ET contact cases. There have been prophecies discussed by many contactees. One of the recurring prophecies, of course, is Earth changes. Even though maybe they didn't all occur on, midnight of the year 2000, as some people thought they would, they certainly seem to be underway. And this is just some global warming data to show that globally the Earth temperatures, both in the ocean and in the atmosphere, are rising. They're rising inexorably, and some of the recent weather, I think, is showing us that they have very real consequences. So some aspects of prophecy do seem to be coming true, although it's not as deterministic or as clear-cut as you might like. There seems to be that free will and other aspects also play a role here. But here's tornadoes, just to show the trend of tornadoes over the last few decades, that also, again, the wild weather is increasing. Some people have mastered the paranormal over the years. In ancient times, they were revered as viziers, wise men. One general term for them is adepts. The Hindu yogis are an example of such people. The Yogananda is depicted here with his teacher, Sri Yukteswar. They could routinely control the paranormal effects that I've been describing. It's not a matter of having a random or very weak manifestation. They were able to do it pretty much on command. The bottom graph shows data from a yogi named Swami Rama that Dr. Elmer Green researched. He put two temperature sensors on his hand, an inch apart, and he said, I'm going to make one of them go up by 5 or 6 degrees and the other one drop by 5 or 6 degrees. And then the graph shows what happened afterwards. He had complete body control over his temperature on his skin, his heart rate. He could even stop his heart or cause what looked like a heart attack. Doctors saw it afterwards and they figured he died, but he hadn't. He'd just been able to have complete control. He said, I'm going to make one of them go up by 5 or 6 degrees and the other one drop by 5 or 6 degrees. And then the graph shows what happened afterwards. He had complete body control over his temperature on his skin, his heart rate. He could even stop his heart or cause what looked like a heart attack. Doctors saw it afterwards and they figured he died, but he hadn't. He'd just been able to have complete control. We could learn a lot from these people because they have a view of the universe which is different from our view. They have an understanding of paranormal phenomena which Western science does not have. So if you can't find an ET to interview, you can at least go back into some of the writings of some of these people. Apollonius of Tyana lived around the same time as Christ, but he was recorded. His miracles and his performances were recorded by the Roman governor of the time and a subject of great interest. Even one of the early church fathers was very disturbed. He says, how is it that the talismans of Apollonius have power in certain members of creation, for they prevent, as we see, the fury of the waves and the violence of the winds and the attacks of wild beasts. And whilst our Lord's miracles are preserved in tradition alone, those of Apollonius are most numerous. And it was disturbing because They tried to take Apollonius to court twice. On one occasion, they opened up a scroll of all of his crimes, and the writing all disappeared. They had to release him for lack of charges. Another occasion, he wrapped his cloak around him and disappeared in a flash. And if these were just rumors, it would be one thing, but they're actually recorded by Roman records of the time. What I think is interesting about studying the yogis is that they do have this very different view of the universe than we in Western science have. This is a graph to illustrate their picture of the different dimensions which exist. The little ball at the bottom, the little sphere, the little bag hanging down, is physical reality. That's where we think everything is. And they are routinely aware of astral and causal and mental domains, and some of them are able to move into those domains and through them. And some of this talent allows them to do some of the miracles which they do. So as our science advances, hopefully we'll start to study and learn about these higher dimensions, and I suspect that that is where some of the keys of the ET technology lies as well. So there are some sort of key yogic principles, but reincarnation and reality of karma are a couple of them that are quite familiar. My suggestion would be that in trying to understand the ETs, we try to look at what some of the yogis' worldview and figure that maybe the ETs know something more than we do about some of these things. Maybe that's how they're able to do what they do. So maybe by studying the yogis, we can get some clues into what these other dimensions are like, and maybe what the real rules of the universe are. One of the, as I mentioned earlier, one of the substance that makes a lot of this stuff possible, the substance that makes physical laws that we're familiar with start to change, start to make batteries go dead, but make things, change our physical, it's called subtle energy. It's called chi, it's called prana. When the yogis do some of their feats, they first have a breathing exercise where they'll breathe in a funny way and they'll build up the prana in their body. If you've ever been to an energy healer, some energy healers are also taught to breathe in this way to build up, it's called a pranayama is the Hindu name for it, to build up this energy in their body, and then that enables them to alter physical laws. And it also responds to consciousness. When psychics talk about an object being charged, what they usually mean is it has prana in it. It has this mysterious energy that our science does not understand today, but seems to be the key to a lot of psychic phenomena. It's been called many things by many people. It keeps getting rediscovered. For the last 200 years, Baron von Reichenbach in Germany, then Victor Schauberger in the 20s and 30s in Europe, Wilhelm Reich, Nikolai Kozyrev in Russia, Robert Pavlita, Czechoslovakia, and Bill Tiller in Arizona are just some of the scientists who have studied this mysterious substance. It appears to be the center of what makes Chinese healing and medicine possible. This graph shows the survival rate of rats that have been treated by a healer at a distance, and when they've been exposed to radiation, and then some are treated and some are not, the survival rates are dramatically different. It's also the center of Chinese martial arts, Qigong. There are Qigong artists who have demonstrated to crowds how they're able to break a steel rod at several feet away by projecting this energy. In this picture, Chinese martial artist is being attacked by some of his fellow classmates with a pole, and he uses this ki or this chi energy to protect him from it. It can be projected. This is data from a Chinese doctor, Dr. Yan, giving a lecture on chi, and while he's giving the lecture, he's attempting to project it, to sort of throw it across in different directions in the classroom. In different directions, there are lithium fluoride detectors. There are particle detectors that are used by particle physicists to measure high-energy particles. And the graph shows what these detectors recorded in the different directions around the room. 30, 40, 50 feet away, they recorded an energy that was far above the background energy, which was a very low level in this graph. So this energy is real. It can be measured, although we still don't understand it. It alters water. When you put some of this charge into water, it causes the Raman spectrum to alter in the water. It causes the hydrogen bonds in the water to change. If you've seen some of the wonderful pictures of water crystals by Dr. Emoto in Japan, you understand that this energy is able to affect how water crystallizes into ice. Kirlian photography, another place where this energy shows up and actually takes a picture of itself. When you apply a high voltage to it, it emits light. This is a whole body image of Kirlian photography. The subject stands on a platform with high voltage, high frequency, and his subtle energy around his body emits light. Over a long time exposure, it becomes visible. And when they try to go out of body, the right-hand picture shows up, indicating an anomalous collection of energy off to the side. So this stuff, we're learning how to measure it, learning how to observe it. If you want to understand how ETs are able to move so fast through space, you might be interested to know that when a subject has its acupuncture points wired up and then recorded, and a solar flare on the sun occurs, it takes 8 or 9 minutes for the light from that solar flare to reach our telescopes. But his acupuncture points show up almost instantly. Disturbance that suggests that the solar flares have some other energy which they emit, which the acupuncture points of the body or the subtle energy system of the body is able to detect. So we have a faster than light transmission of something. There have also been, when you apply laser light to DNA in a vacuum, it also seems to create this energy, and it causes anomalous structuring of the vacuum. And I'm going to go quickly over this. There's a lot to suggest here, but one of the first researchers on subtle energy was Baron von Reichenbach in Germany, 1850s, around the same time that Michael Faraday was doing his electrical experiments, learning about electricity and magnetism. Von Reichenbach would take people who he called sensitives, who were good, who were, sort of like psychics today, perhaps. He had a test for them, one way to figuring out were they good enough to use. He would give them a little business card and have them hold it on 4 fingers horizontally. As they tried to make energy in their mind's visualization pass up through the card from their hand, he would see if the card would rotate. If it would, they were considered high sensitives, and they were the ones who were best able to visualize or to see his energy. I've actually done this myself. I don't consider myself very psychic, but he also had a little cheat for those of us who are not as sensitive. If you hold graphite in the left hand, like a charcoal briquette, it helps to increase the polarization and the flow. And in 2 out of 3 times, I was able to make the card spin when my right hand was holding it. So, there's something to this. What von Reichenbach would do then is put these people in dark rooms, give them an hour to several hours to light adapt, and then ask them to describe what they saw. They had no idea what the experiments were. In one case, a wire would go outside and be exposed to sunlight. These people saw something coming out of the wire, some kind of energy. It's not light. It's nothing conventional. It's some kind of subtle energy. Crystals also emit this same strange substance. Take a good quality quartz crystal with a nice sharp point on it. In the dark, there's a very faint blue light that comes from the point of the crystal. Again, I've repeated this experiment myself, and after a couple of hours, especially if you try to relax while doing this, you can see the blue light. So there's something real to all of this, although it's not conventional light. You can't photograph it. He tried. It does not show up in photography. It's another form of energy. Similarly, magnets emit the same type of energy. Nikolai Kozyrev in Russia discovered that when certain physical processes occur, such as evaporation of acetone as one example, that it causes this time density change, which appears to be another form of subtle energy, and actually can cause torsion arms to rotate. So there's a torque aspect to this energy. Every living process, every changing process, thermodynamic processes also create one of two forms of this energy. And he was able to show that you can focus this energy, reflect it, and transmit it to some other location. And when you do, you can change the mass of another object, change the density of another object. So some of the strange effects that we see in UFOs, people go into a UFO for an hour and come out with 5 days beard growth, are hard for our science to explain. But Kozyrev is learning how to slow down and speed up time with these experiments. And so these are clues to what might be some part of ET technology. One of the other really dramatic uses of subtle energy done by Victor Schauberger, the Austrian water wizard, he found that, this is a picture of him behind a device of his he called the Sackwendel, which basically involves flowing water. And what it does, he invented a kind of water pipe that's much more efficient than conventional water pipes. A straight water pipe has friction. You put pressure on the water, it flows through it at some speed. What Schauberger showed is that when you twist the pipe, give it what he called a double spiral, looks like a ram's horn, a double spiral, at a certain speed, the friction decreases enormously. A German professor who was a skeptic got money from the German government back in the 30s and did the experiments shown on this graph. He was going to expose Schauberger as a fraud. What he found was that at a certain velocity of flow, the friction goes negative. The resistance goes negative, which means the water comes out faster than you put it in. So it's a free energy device. And what Schauberger did with this was make a recirculation system where the water that comes out is then put back in again. And it's just going to keep speeding up. And you can build from it a concentration of this subtle energy. It starts to give off a bluish light, and its weight begins to change. And from that, he built it into a device which could levitate. When this prana, this chi, this bluish, lightish energy builds up in concentration, this thing begins lifting off. And this was an actual model that he demonstrated in the 30s. Shortly after that, Hitler and the Nazi government grabbed it, would not allow him to be a part of their experiments. But one of his technicians was brought into the experiment and later told him that they built a full-scale device that worked. So this is one aspect of levitation where subtle energy has a direct tie-in. Robert Pavlita, a Czech inventor, learned that this subtle energy has an affinity to certain types of materials, that you can build small machines, little devices that can be then charged with subtle energy, and they will move, they will respond to thought. They do a remarkable series of things that just totally defy Western science, but they show that subtle energy is real and it can be engineered. One of his remarkable devices actually was an ESP machine. It had a little arm on it, and 5 ESP cards, for example, could be put below the arm. If a person in another room pictured one of the ESP cards and tried to send that image to the machine, the arm of the machine would slowly move and hover over the correct card. And according to Pavlita, the accuracy was 100% in these ESP experiments. The writers, Ostrander and Schroeder, in their book Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, which came out in 1970, have a whole chapter about Pavlita and his devices, and other scientists from the U.S. went there and verified these things. Subtle energy seems to respond to shape. Certain shapes, like pyramids, have unusual effects on subtle energy. Here's some data from a French investigator, Naudin, which apparently shows that the time rate of an oscillator is different. It's affected by being in the middle of a pyramid. It's very interesting and suggestive. Wilhelm Reich, a German medical doctor, came to the U.S., very controversial, did a lot of experiments with what's called orgone. It appears to be the same stuff. He found that this stuff comes from the sun. if you build a certain kind of box that has iron plates on the inside, then an organic layer, wood or wool, and then layer it in this fashion, it would build up an accumulation of this subtle energy inside. And when you did so, strange things began to happen. In one case, he found that if you put a radioactive source in the box, that energy seemed to accelerate the concentration of the subtle energy in the box, but it also caused it to have some very harmful physiological effects. And pretty soon the entire laboratory was showing anomalies, physical anomalies, that they would do experiments and get answers that were just crazy. Geiger counters, for example, would increase their count rate by hundreds of times over normal. This stuff interacted with nuclear energy, apparently. Batteries would go dead, all kind not so strange, maybe. Which also, again, occurs in the crop circles, which is another configuration. It's a layering of the wheat that probably is designed to create subtle energy of a certain type. So a variety of effects where physics as we know it is being altered by the presence of this subtle energy. In some cases you can see with your eye the motion of some of these little particles that were aspects of this subtle energy. And here's just a graph showing that when radioactivity was placed in this orgone or subtle energy, the count rates changed dramatically. He could basically make a radium watch, the dial on a radium watch, dim and go out. The radioactive decay rate was altered, and this was all happening in the early 50s, don't forget, when it was a time where the nuclear arms race was just getting started. It was the most sensitive subject in our government, and the fact that he was doing these experiments then showing how to neutralize radioactivity might have something to do with the fact that he was under something like 6% of the FDA budget was being devoted to investigating him. And eventually he was imprisoned and died within a year in prison in the 50s. There might be some connection there, who knows. But other people have duplicated some of these experiments, so there seems to be something very real about them. Bill Tiller, a former professor of material science at Stanford University, has also been investigating subtle energy. What he's been doing is implanting electronic chips in a meditative situation with 4 meditators. You take an EEPROM device, where you're trying to make a device that will create random energy, random electrical signals. But when 4 meditators try to charge it up while they're doing this, they find that this device can affect physical phenomena in remarkable ways. They'll take a device like this, which he calls an IIED, an intention-implanted device, and they'll ship it hundreds of miles from Arizona to Boston, set it up near some water. And if they have implanted the device to raise the pH of water, they find that, in fact, the pH of water does increase. When this device operates for several days, it begins to, well, here's a device, here's some data showing how the pH does change when the device is present. But some weird effects occur they had not expected. It begins to affect the laboratory. It begins apparently to charge up the laboratory with this subtle energy or prana, and physical parameters like temperature become coupled. They have oscillations of temperature in places in the lab where it should not be occurring, and similar coupled synchronized oscillations occur in other labs which they have been in other places at the same time. There's some kind of spatial correlation that seems to occur when this subtle energy builds up concentration. So it's a totally baffling effect by our current science, but it really suggests that that we're on the verge of a revolution to try to explain some of these things. Tiller calls it the raising of the gauge. Electromagnetism, our normal electricity and magnetism, is called a U1 gauge in physics. Tiller proposes that that gauge is raised to a higher dimension, which then accounts for how consciousness is able to affect it and how it has some of these weird effects. So paranormal evidence supports other dimensions, astral phenomena, interaction with consciousness, and the old rules are broken. A theory is clearly needed, and my role has been to try to at least make a beginning. There's a long way to go, probably. Here's a list of 14 areas where we're seeing breakdowns of physics, or where our current science needs to be able to account for new phenomena. As we start that process, humility is advised. Two quotes by Einstein: "Whoever undertakes to set up himself as a judge in the field of truth and knowledge is shipwrecked by the laughter of the gods." And if we knew what we were doing, it would not be called research, would it? My approach has been intuition, visualizing how things work first, trying to do the math later. That was the way Einstein approached much of his physics. He's got his best ideas from picturing himself a little Gedanken, or thought experiments. Here he is sitting on a light beam, which is how relativity got started. At the very smallest scale in our current physical view, particles move forward and backward in time, a very rapid random dance. They interact with other energy in the vacuum. In my proposed model, the player that has been left out so far is the distant matter of the cosmos, that when these little particles locally are bouncing back and forth in space and time, it's because they're interacting with other particles in the universe, often very far away. The other key element of my proposed model is that you allow the photons, the light waves, to travel both forward in time and backward in time. This is actually a very legitimate idea. It's been proposed by eminent scientists before now. There are no contradictions, but what it allows is to have a real two-way interaction with things that are far away. Another aspect that's key to this model is that when, at the very smallest scales, these particles travel at the speed of light, or very close to it. When they do, and they emit light, it travels straight ahead in the direction that they're moving at that moment. It's like the light beam from a motorcycle that just goes in the direction that the front wheel is pointing. That means that electrons interact only with other electrons that are kind of in the direction that they're looking at the moment when the interaction occurs. It's a non-local theory in that things are coupled together even though they're very far away. And that, if you think about it, is what psychic phenomena is too. The psychic phenomena does not care about distance or about time. It can travel forward and backward in time. So it's similar to the point of view being taken here. What you end up with is the idea that at a level below current physics, current quantum mechanics talks about a photon as being a wave of energy. But this model takes you one step below that, to the idea that there really are pulses, very quick little interactions of two electrons that just happen to be lined up in their velocity and their direction at an instant. They give a short, very strong pulse, which allows them to interact with each other even across the distance of the universe. And it's these pulses then which make up, at a deeper level, what we think of as the wave packet or the photon in quantum mechanics. The key idea here is that when this happens, particles only interact when they're pointing at each other, when their velocities just happen to be pointing in the right direction. If you have two particles that are across the universe from each other, but their velocities are lined up, they see each other. They exert a force on each other. One of them can cause the other one to bend and deflect. What this leads to is the idea that the only ones that interact with each other are the ones who have circular motions that are coupled in phase and in frequency. So they're all looking, at another one at just that moment when the interaction occurs. Those are the ones who see each other. Other particles can be present, but if they have different frequencies or different phases, they're pointing in the wrong direction. They don't see the other ones. It's like they're not there. They make up the noise, the quantum noise, but the first ones are the ones we call our physical reality. Here's a quote from Prigogine, Nobel Prize winner, just supporting the idea that this type of picture will lead to a coupled set of oscillators. So one moment later, the electron in the center has been bent a little bit. Now he's pointing in a different direction. If, when he looks in that direction, there's a particle out there in the distant matter that's pointing back at him, they can also have an interaction. And in this way, the oscillations of things that are nearby and things that are far away become coupled together. It's like the idea of a fan with a strobe light on it. The strobe light, when it's synchronized with the blades of the fan, makes the fan blade appear to be solid. If it's not synchronized, the fan blade disappears. This leads to a picture in which our universe, our physical universe, is like a sheet of paper where everything is in phase, where all the phases are lined up and synchronized with each other. There can be other systems of particles which have other frequencies or other phases. They're coupled to their friends on their sheet of paper, but they don't see ours. The only coupling between our sheet of paper, our universe, and other ones is random, which we call quantum noise. But our physics, our conventional, present, mainstream physics, describes what happens when you stay on one sheet of paper in this picture. Subtle energy, which is what we're talking about today, that violates these rules, occurs when there's couplings across the sheets of paper. These are physical phenomena where there's correlations between motions across the sheets of paper. Then you can begin to bring in things which violate current physics. You can bring energy in, for example, from other parallel dimensions and make free energy devices. That's just one example. These parallel dimensions, these parallel sheets of paper, in general, don't see each other. So you can have other physical realities present right here where I'm standing, but you'd be unaware of them. You might be able to pick up slight variations in the quantum noise, which is what the REG machines from the Princeton Paralab see. And that's an indication of the existence of the other dimensions. But in fact, you would not see these other parallel systems unless you shift your frequency or shift your phase. Then you can shift from this reality to another one. The idea is a little bit like flatland, where if you have a sphere passing through a plane, people who live in the plane and are aware of nothing else, suddenly as the sphere passes through it, a point becomes a circle, and these miracles occur, which we call paranormal phenomena. The model appears to be consistent with mainstream physics. It seems to offer a way of explaining some aspects of mainstream physics that right now are just part of hypotheses. It also appears to offer a way of connecting with the string models, because these little self-orbits that the electrons undergo in my picture probably are kind of like the surface of the string in the string model. So it has some encouraging aspects to it. The last piece of the model basically is the holographic piece, that when these particles are interacting with the radiation coming in, they have to kind of send out whatever comes in. There's a reflection that goes on, and the distant matter of the universe is where everything goes to and everything comes back from in this sort of two-way picture. So the distant matter of the universe acts like a holographic plate. And if you have a stable object, anything, a ball, a cue ball, a computer, a microphone, it's always having energy coming into it and reflecting energy out again. And if this form is a stable form, then there's going to be an echoing pattern of energy on the distant matter that kind of holds this pattern in place and reflects the energy back to give it stability. Then that's the hologram. But it's a four-dimensional hologram because it has to be able to account for energy that goes into the past and comes back, and energy into the future and comes back. So it's like Michael Talbot's holographic universe, but it's one higher dimension because now time is a part of the picture as well. So here's a way of depicting this situation. You have the blue ellipse at the top is the future image of the universe. That's where radiation goes out to and comes back from into the future and then back. Likewise, you have a past image of the universe. Energy goes back into time and then comes back again to the present. So we have to have a balance of both of these images. What this allows for is now we can imagine stable energy forms which are maintained by these holographic patterns of distant matter. These stable energy forms don't require physical matter. Now you can see how orbs and astral bodies and souls and these forms that our present science cannot explain, but how they can have a permanence to them. They can have a physics to them because the distant matter is what gives them their stability. Likewise, when a person in normal consciousness, you're kind of getting back all the radiation that you send out. But suppose you're able, using your mind to, well, first of all, of course, the DNA is a double helix, and it's perfectly designed to interact with this type of system. Its phase conjugate waves are sort of perfectly designed for it, so it's a suggestion that maybe this is why DNA has the shape that it does. When the mind enters a special state, if the mind enters a meditative state where it's highly synchronized, highly coupled, which means that our brain waves become alpha or even theta or delta, the brain has a cohesion to its oscillations, that then you can begin to affect the vibrations of the distant matter. You can begin to alter the hologram that the distant matter shows, and when you alter it, then you can cause unusual things to happen. Then you can send out waves that don't come back to you, but they refocus somewhere else. They refocus at a very great distance away, or at another time. Here's a picture of ESP where you're sending an image or a psychokinetic influence backward in time. So this picture explains why it is these forces don't weaken with distance and how we can send them forward and backward in time. If you have a craft that wants to project itself a long ways very quickly, and by the same method, it can project a pattern of energy into the distant matter in the future and in the past. So that pattern refocuses again, but not at the current location, at another location. And this is a model for how hyperjumps can occur. Likewise, because this entire picture is based on the vibrations of distant matter, you can see how certain shapes, like pyramids, for example, the whole science of sacred geometry could have a physical basis because certain repetitive shapes would resonate well with the certain oscillations of distant matter. In terms of understanding ETs, which is, of course, one of our interests, how do we try to understand a group that maybe understands some of this stuff far better than we do? They might think about things in a different way than we do. We are kind of rooted in the physical reality here, wealth, oil, the materialistic rat race, etc. When somebody comes in who has technology that does not need oil, they don't have tailpipes sticking out from their flying saucers, no exhaust, no petrol, it's going to upset our current economic system. And it's natural that there might be some opposition from those who have a lot to lose. Of course, when we're trying to understand ETs, it's important to be aware that there are various influences that might divert us from the truth about them. And so, as in all of the subjects here that I'm talking about, it's important, as you well know, to try to separate fact from fiction and figure out what's really going on. But my suspicion is that looking at the yogis and the humans on this planet who have mastered these abilities and who look upon the physical reality as just the lowest of a whole lot of higher dimensions, they probably have other things on their minds besides just grabbing territory. They're worried about their karma, they're worried about their future lives, they have a lot of things. And so I think that as we try to put ourselves in the place of these other beings, we might, it's helpful to consider what other forces are at play and what other rules are at play. And this is just the beginning. And I have a website, synchronizeduniverse.com. Please feel free to visit it. This is just the beginning. The books will be on sale out in the lobby. Thank you. I think we have 3 or 4 minutes for questions, I think, if there's enough time, if there are any questions.
Hello? I read your book, and in your book you said you have several other volumes that you're preparing. I'm just wondering what they might cover and when they might be available.
Good question. Yes, you're quite right. This book originally was going to be one book, and it was going to be 40. It grew into 47 chapters, which then became reorganized, and there's sort of 5 books in the series. Volume 2, I'm hoping, will be out before the end of the year. It'll be on subtle energy and some of the things talked about today will be covered in more detail. Volume 3 is about the soul and about reincarnation and these other higher aspects that I talked about today very briefly. Volume 4 is about technology. There's a lot of new technology that's implied by this new science, going over that, and then Volume 5 will be the theory. Yes?
You speak of this glue or force that is minimal that holds everything together at the very beginning of the talk. Am I not remembering it correctly? The smallest element that seems to connect everything. And then as you went through the lecture, isn't this pretty much following what they're studying and calling string theory?
I couldn't quite get that.
Isn't this pretty much following what they call string theory, that side of physics?
There are some similarities to string theory. One problem with string theory is that that physicists who do string theory are usually motivated by experiment. They know what particles are out there. They know what our current physical laws are, and that motivates the choices they make and how they build their theory. They are completely unaware of all paranormal phenomena. Okay, you cannot publish paranormal research in physics journals. You can't even talk about it. Most physicists are unaware of it, and so they could come across a very good version of string theory that might explain some of these things. They'd probably reject it because it appears to predict things which they think don't occur. So,
well, they are moving into the concept of dimensions and the possibility of moving from one dimension to another as you create your own reality type concept.
Absolutely. In string theory, originally there were 10 dimensions, and then now up to 12 now. And so they have some aspects of this picture. The higher dimensional aspects are built into string theory. However, the extra dimensions, the ones above our 4 dimensions of space and time, they only occur at very small scales. In other words, those other dimensions kind of rolled up in a tiny little ball that occurs at 10 to the minus 33 meters. I mean, it's unimaginably small scales. So it would not explain how a craft or a person is able to shift into another dimension. Okay, those are like large-scale effects. And right now, string theory has no way of explaining these large-scale effects.
Are they making any attempt, or are they going to keep it pure?
They don't think it happens. So.
Okay. One quick question. If in 1930 the Germans could levitate, where is that technology, and why aren't we doing it today so I can get home a lot quicker?
If you find a place to buy one of these, I'd like to buy one too.
What happened to that technology, truly?
It goes behind closed doors. The same thing with Roswell and every other,
Well, do you believe that it's still being worked with?
Yeah.
That it's trying to get it into something that ultimately becomes economically feasible so we can buy it?
Yeah, well, I think that the problem is these things are so important to the people who have the power, okay, that they don't really want it out in the public. That's my suspicion. People have reports of these craft flying around that are probably not from somewhere else. They're probably our own reconstructions of these things. So technology, I suspect, exists, but if it were released into the public, then think what was the first thing that would happen? People would stop buying oil. Okay?
Thank you.
Is the paranormal evidence, trying to understand the science that may be behind what allows ETs to do what they do. As any of you know who's ever been to a crop circle, sometimes batteries go dead instantly in very strange circumstances, so we may have already seen a paranormal event. We'll open that possibility up. My background is as a physicist, and I really was motivated by curiosity, by trying to understand the universe at a deep level, which drew me into physics in the first place. In the mid-'80s, I had been working on my own a version of a unified field theory, trying to understand how things connected together. I was not really satisfied with the explanation I'd learned in college and in graduate school. And I came across remote viewing. It was presented to me in a way that I knew it had to be true, and yet it violated everything I had been taught in school. And, but I realized at the same time that maybe this is what I was missing. If I could understand remote viewing, it was a clue that our current science is missing some important things. And that started my own quest for researching every aspect of the paranormal, every subject that is ridiculed and is, is sort of not believed by mainstream science and mainstream culture, but to figure out for myself, is it real or not? And that process has been one of trying to be skeptical, but at the same time be open-minded, going by the evidence. And what I found is that a lot of the phenomena, including UFOs, of course, when you look into them, there's a huge amount of evidence, and our science, at least the mainstream science, has not taken it into account yet. Our current theorists who do mainstream physics in universities are not working on the phenomena that UFOs exhibit. So the net result of my research is a book, The Synchronized Universe, in which I gave him 117 prophecies of the future. This is just one example. And he came back and he recorded them all. Dr. Raymond Moody recorded them. And at this point, about 98% of them have come true since 1975. So these other realms seem to show up in both ET cases and in near-death cases. The tunnel is often the way one gets from our physical realm to these other realms. The tunnel shows up in out-of-body experiences. Robert Monroe, who went out-of-body many times, was one of the great pioneers of out-of-body experiences, said that a black hole would appear on his wall, and that would be the entrance of a tunnel. He'd go in there and come out in some other dimension. Oftentimes, ET abduction cases, the ETs are seen coming out of little holes in the wall. This is a painting from Hieronymus Bosch that was painted hundreds of years ago, but again, it has angels, and it has a realm of light at the other end, so it's the same, it's a depiction of the same type of tunnel between dimensions. As our science progresses, we're starting to get clues about these other dimensions. They seem to be quite real. There are measurable aspects of them. In this case, Robert Monroe was having an out-of-body experience, but he did an experiment. He had a room that had a Faraday cage around it. There were wires in the walls of the cage, and it really sounds loud. Are you sure the sound? Is it echoing back there, or? Yeah. Hello? Can we turn down the sound a little bit? There's a lot of echo out here, a lot of reverb. I'm hearing myself. So he did an experiment. He wanted to see what the effect would be of high voltage on the wires of the Faraday cage in this room. Well, hello? Is this too low? It's too low now. They said it was too high before. It would either reverbs or it's too low, one or the other. Is there any medium? This one, okay. This is not on right now, though, or is it? Okay, all right. How's this level? Is this better? Okay. I think we're in a crop circle. So what Monroe did was charge up the wires in his Faraday cage to 50,000 volts. And then he tried to have an out-of-body experience. Now, normally when there was no voltage on the wires, he went right through the wires, no problem. But with the high voltage, he found the wires trapped his astral body, ensnared it. So we're learning that, and this also has shown up in other OBE cases. And I don't know if you remember, Bill Cooper talked about an ET that was held captive back in the 50s, and whether it's a credible case, I don't know. But again, it was a Faraday cage, which he claimed was used to keep the little fellow from going out of body and escaping. So there's something real to this phenomenon. And as you may recall, the Ghostbusters movie, they used a Faraday cage on a high voltage to keep their little spirits in check. As we learn more about ET cases, there are some that give us insights into higher dimensions. Stephen Greer recounts a credible witness who was practicing going out of body. He was going up into the sky, and as he rose through the atmosphere, he bumped into something. He looked back and he found that there was a flying saucer there, a small one, that was in the astral domain, is not in the physical, but there were little beings on board who were aware of him, and he was aware of them. So it's a clue that the ETs are very familiar with astral technology, even though to us it may still be a very mysterious regime. Time travel is often encountered in contact and abduction cases. Sometimes technology hints come from cases, and these technology hints seem very relevant, trying to bridge the gap between our science and the science of the ETs. These are a couple of quotes from one of Shirley MacLaine's books, Out on a Limb. Supposedly a Pleiadian named Mayan gave the following information to one of the people in Shirley MacLaine's book. And you can either take or leave such information, but as a scientist, this information bowled me over, because to me it communicated information that made sense to me, and it was a good guide. It talks about pull together the best evidence for a lot of the anomalies that I've investigated. And also the last chapter is sort of the beginnings of a theory. It's an attempt to say, how can we take our present science and start to expand it to begin to explain some of these things that UFOs exhibit and other paranormal phenomena show. The panel discussion on Friday night talked about possible motivations for UFOs and ETs, why they're here, what they're all about. I think to have a hope of understanding that question, it's important to see the universe the way they see it. They clearly have some capabilities we don't have, some technologies, and maybe their worldview is also quite different from ours. So as we develop a science of the paranormal, we may also be able to better answer some of those questions. There are many connections between UFO, ET technology and the paranormal. I'll give you just a few examples. Of course, saucers levitate. That's one of their most spectacular features, and quietly too. But down through the ages, there are many, many credible accounts of people levitating. This is a photograph or a drawing on the right-hand side of Brother Joseph of Cupertino, a monk, and he had a habit which embarrassed his fellow monks. When he got ecstatic in prayer, he would often start lifting up into the air. They had to drag him down. Sometimes when he was serving dinner in church, he would also, when the choir began, they would make him sit in the back because he was distracting. He would sometimes lift up into the air, and he couldn't control it. It was investigated by the Pope, very thorough investigation of hundreds of witnesses, and they made him a saint because they concluded that it was real. There are many people who have exhibited this phenomena. It's just one aspect of the paranormal. Out-of-body experiences. The top drawing shows a out-of-body case described in the parapsychological literature by Mr. and Mrs. Landau. Mrs. Landau had a habit of going out of body at night while asleep. Mr. Landau was in bed and had her do an experiment where he asked her to bring an object from her bedroom across the hall into his. This sketch is taken shortly after that. She's just deposited a small stuffed dog by his bedside and is exiting the room, except what is exiting the room is a pale, semi-transparent copy of herself, while her physical body is observable across the room. This is just one of many out-of-body cases from from that scientific literature. The bottom drawing is from Betty Andreas and Luca. She's during an abduction. She's being taken in an out-of-body form by a little ET. Her physical body is lying on the couch. Her OBE body is being taken up to the craft for training and teaching sessions, etc. This is often reported in abduction cases. Orbs, another phenomenon that does not fit our science, but is commonly reported in ET encounter cases. They often show up over the bed, hovering as little balls of light of different colors. The top drawing is from Betty Andreas and Luca again, balls of light orbiting a larger sphere over a lake. The bottom photograph is from a friend of mine. A bunch of us had gone on a camp out trying to get pictures of orbs. The 12-year-old daughter of one of the people in the group took this spectacular photograph of a 3-foot diameter orb in the afternoon. So there's daylight. It's the post of the cabin is observable through the orb. Behind it, there's reflections of the sky, the trees, the ground. So it's a wonderful photograph. Orbs are often seen around haunted houses. This is a photograph around a haunted house that I used to own a part share of. They move very rapidly sometimes, thousands of feet per second, but flash photographs can show them up. In ET cases, the soul is often a topic of discussion. The bottom drawing here is from Betty Andreas de Luca, again, from one of her encounter cases. But there are many people, Whitley Strieber and many others, who have talked about lessons they have received during their abductions about the nature of the soul, the nature of reincarnation, the nature of higher dimensions. The top drawing is from Daniel Brinkley, a near-death experiencer. He's been dead 3 times, the first time for 28 minutes. He was in a body bag, ready to be taken off to the morgue, when he found himself suddenly back in the body, and he was paralyzed because of his injuries. I think the volume is too loud here. He was paralyzed due to his injuries. He could only breathe, so he made a little puff of breath that disturbed the body bag, and an orderly luckily saw it, and they didn't take him to the morgue. But during his near-death experience, he saw the typical tunnel. He went into a realm of light. There was a light being who interviewed him and projected great love. And then these other beings